I would like to welcome you to this third open panel of the Stockholm Security Conference. My name is Jannie Lilja, and I'm the Director of Studies for Peace and Development at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. Our discussion today will address how challenges to international cooperation impact humanitarian work. In the course of history, cooperation between governments has not always been the case, but it has proven to be the most effective way of tackling global problems and the most inclusive one. Today, we want to dig into how recent dynamics in the multilateral system have challenged initiatives to improve the lives of people in the most vulnerable situations. People affected by violent conflict, by forced displacement, by hunger and disease. And we will also be pointing to ways forward in terms of action, including preventive action and what that could look like in practical terms. We will be conducting this discussion from the perspective of representatives of three major humanitarian organizations that together with some others form the backbone of the international humanitarian system. I'm delighted to have with me today Dr. Gillian Triggs, who is Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Dr. Triggs is a highly renowned expert in international law and has held a number of eminent appointments in service to human rights and to the refugee cause. Most recently, Dr. Triggs was the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission and emeritus professor at the University of Melbourne. We also have a Nobel Peace Prize laureate on our panel, Ms. Valerie Newsom-Guarnieri, representative of the World Food Programme, where she serves as Assistant Secretary General and Assistant Executive Director for Operations Services. Valerie leads cutting-edge program and policy development towards ending hunger, and she's spearheading WFP's efforts to ensure protection and inclusion, to expand nutrition programs, further the empowerment of women, and to build resilient food systems, among other things. Previously, she also provided oversight over essential food assistance to the most food insecure people around the world. And finally, I'm delighted to also welcome Dr. Helen Durham, Director of International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. In her role, Helen oversees a large global network of international lawyers, policy advisors, armed forces and police, weapons specialists, sociologists, researchers, and academic experts who work towards the respect of international humanitarian law. A warm welcome to the three of you. It's a great pleasure having you here. I would like to divide the discussion into two parts. And I would like us first to set the scene and share our assessments of what humanitarian needs look like today, not least considering the impact that COVID-19 has had on these needs. Then I will ask you to reflect on the role of interstate cooperation, essentially what you need to get your work done, the enabling environment. After this first block, we move on to a second part of the discussion, which is more action-oriented, and what can be done in terms of improving the situation as regards international cooperation and what we need to think about in the future. So first, let us start out with your reading of the present situation today in terms of humanitarian needs. And also, if you could please comment or mention the role that each of your organizations play or are supposed to play in addressing those needs. So may I first turn to you, Helen? Could we start out with you and your assessment in brief?
Well, thank you very much. And it's a delight to be on a panel with eminent guests to have this important discussion. I don't think you can think about the multilateral system without involving the humanitarians we work in and around it. As you mentioned, the International Committee of the Red Cross has a mandate and focus around armed conflict and other situations of violence. And I think today what we're seeing, and I'm sure my colleagues would join me in this, is that the pandemic is exacerbating humanitarian needs, both at an individual level, but it's also putting pressure on systems that were previously fragile anyway, and particularly for those that are involved in or are victims of armed conflict. So I think it's really important, though, also, if we're going to have an entry point about the pandemic in the wider humanitarian world, that we look at the fact that the pressure has been put on the multilateral system as well. And we can see the fragile points that perhaps we'll talk about a little later in a more detailed sense. But the fragile points of the multilateral system is also having pressure on it today. Perhaps if we want to look at some of the trends, and it is important, I must note, that the COVID is also allowing us to have some opportunities, in particularly in the digital space. So we must make sure that we seize those opportunities. But when it comes to the trends around the multilateral system, I think it's really important to, I think, reflect from at least the ICRC's point of view in the last few years, as we've engaged in discussions around normative developments on the laws of war, that there's been a strong rise in a state focus. I think state and sovereign systems have been quite strong recently, and it's been a lot harder than perhaps a decade ago to create new infrastructure. That being said, in the wider field where we work, we're seeing the interface between those who are affected by armed conflict and climate. We are seeing challenges due to the nature of protracted conflict, whereas I think traditional understandings between the humanitarian system in the short term and the development system as being questions. We're seeing, for example, the increased role of non-state armed groups. And recently, my colleagues were advising me, we deal with approximately 465 non-state armed groups globally. And the reason why we engage with them is up to 60 to 70 million individuals are under the control of these groups. So how can we think about the multilateral system if we don't think a little more widely than just states? So I think that when you look at new technologies in warfare, and then you look at the role that technology is playing, and it's surfaced up in the pandemic, I think there's some of the challenges that we're looking at, the ways we're needing to pivot as a humanitarian organisation to deal with them. Perhaps later on we can talk a little bit about the pressure put on healthcare and those individuals, the healthcare providers, who are also in many experiences in conflict that we're witnessing, are becoming vulnerable and actually having more attacks on healthcare workers due to stigmatization, fear that, in fact, rather than providing assistance, they are in fact bringing some of the pandemics into communities. So I think we need to look at a multi-layer level, but there's some of the key trends that we're witnessing as the ICRC.
Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing this slightly sobering picture with us. Gillian, could I then turn to you? Do you see the same as Helen does, or are there additional aspects that you would like to highlight based on your experiences on working with refugees?
Thank you very much. Yes, I would very much agree with that. In fact, Helen's given us a very nice introduction. But there are two things that I'd really like to stress from the point of view of the United Nations Refugee Agency. And that is in terms of influences on the humanitarian needs. One is the huge rise, exponential rise in people in need of international protection. We reported for last year 80 million people either displaced within their own countries, in conflict, typically conflict, poverty, discrimination, and something like 26 million refugees and asylum seekers, along with countless numbers who are stateless. But we're dealing probably with something in the order of 90 million today and rising. So the sheer numbers have to be a key feature of what we're discussing today. And perhaps if I can put that in context, we're just about to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the UN Refugee Agency. And when it was established 70 years ago, the United Nations parties, as they then were, I think 26 or so states, were concerned about 1.25 million people left over, if you like, displaced from the Second World War, and they built a system, a normative system for a right to claim asylum, to seek protection, and never to be returned. So there we were in 1951, and then you fast forward today, we have a system where exactly the same normative rules are in place, but we're dealing with massively increased numbers. That's the first point. The second is, of course, as Helen said, the COVID threats of COVID. The COVID pandemic as a global pandemic have led to threats to the protection of refugees that we've never seen in 70 years of the development of that law. It's quite extraordinary. And if I could give you one example, at the height, 168 countries of the 193 closed their borders to refugees, to asylum seekers, with nearly 100 denying access to asylum systems at all, and 27 credibly documented cases of returns to danger and violence. So we're seeing today, sadly, one of some of the most profound threats to the 20th centuries and now 21st centuries regime for the protection of displaced people and refugees. To put a more positive note on this, however, and it perhaps goes a little bit to Helen's point about state sovereignty. A couple of years ago, the international community agreed, 181 countries agreed, that with regard to refugees and the Global Compact for Refugees, they would share responsibilities globally. Now, this was before COVID. And COVID arrived 2 years later, no one could have possibly imagined this. We're now finding that we've actually got in the Compact on Refugees a vision and a strategy for managing the COVID crisis at the global level. There are strains in the system, but I'm reasonably optimistic that while we've taken a couple of steps backwards, the Compact on Refugee provides us with a base on which to move forward again as the pandemic subsides.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And these numbers are truly staggering, I have to admit, and they are increasing all the time. Valerie, you work on food insecurity, and I understand that this work must be intimately tied both to developments as regards violent conflict and forced displacement. Would you be able to provide us with an additional layer of analysis when it comes to humanitarian needs from a WFP perspective?
Well, thank you so much for that opportunity. And I really will build on the comments by Helen and Gillian and perhaps do a bit of a dive in on the issues of hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition. Because the trends as we've seen them, even coming into the COVID pandemic, we were seeing hunger on the rise. And that was primarily on the rise due to the rise in violent conflict and also the impact of climate on populations. Helen or Gillian referred to 80 million people forcibly displaced. Those displacements coming as a result of conflict and climate. 690 million chronically hungry people in the world. 60% of that is in countries that are affected by conflict. And we're really on track to we're not on track at all to achieving SDG 2, and we're on track to reaching Agenda 2030 and having the number of hungry people higher than it's been in this century. So, very alarming issues on the hunger side, and now here comes COVID. With COVID, what we're finding is that it's been a shock multiplier on top of conflict and on top of climate, and we're not really, and it's driving hunger to historic levels. And we're not really talking about the impact of the virus itself, but when we look at important measures put in place to try to contain the virus and its spread, we see a tremendous socioeconomic impact that has ripple effects in the economies and the poorest economies around the world, and the most vulnerable are hit most of all. This includes populations who are already dependent on humanitarian assistance, who have seen their access to that assistance cut off or at risk of being cut off, but it also has put new categories of already vulnerable people into the ranks of those requiring assistance. And we have urban populations, urban dwellers, urban refugees are among them. We have migrant workers, those who are employed in the informal sector, those who have been dependent on remittances, are finding both their livelihoods disappearing in front of their eyes, and at the same time facing increased prices in the markets where they shop for their food and other basic needs. So really set up for a very bad situation that is hitting them both from the supply side and the demand side. So as WFP, our role is a large humanitarian organization. We're reaching 100 million people in 80 countries, providing food assistance and working with communities to improve nutrition and help build resilience. In the face of COVID, our focus was initially on adapting operations, like all the other organizations, to try to make sure they were safe for the people we serve, as well as for staff and partner organizations, and sustaining operations by offering services that would enable aid workers to be moving in and out of context, in a context where commercial services were no longer functioning, and scaling up operations where necessary to address basic needs. So the common services part of that I highlighted before has been an effort to deliver medicine, medical equipment, and staff and supplies on behalf of the health community, the humanitarian community, and the development community. And this has been a major effort. 25,000 passengers brought to 68 destinations, 92,000 cubic meters of cargo delivered to 171 countries. This has been a major undertaking, which we've been able to pull back on as commercial services resumed, but remain ready to provide as needed. But also key has been partnering with governments, and it's Helen who was mentioning the systems impact of the crisis. So partnering with governments to strengthen social protection systems in order to be able to reach more vulnerable people with that assistance that they urgently needed, ensuring that those systems reach into communities, include the most vulnerable, and provide them with robust support, but also working with nations to try to strengthen and sustain food systems that are absolutely essential to be ensuring equitable access for populations. And we need to make sure that food systems deliver nutrition in a sustainable way to those furthest behind. So this is how we've been working to address the situation. And as we look forward to 2021, we see the need to do more of the same, but we do see a situation where resourcing may be potentially more scarce, given that many of the nations who so generously support all of our organizations are feeling the economic crunch from the COVID crisis.
Thank you so much, Valerie. And let us focus a bit more now in depth on the actual implications that sort of challenges pertaining to intergovernmental cooperation has for your on-the-ground work. You have mentioned, Helen, the undermining or the sovereignty card being sort of asserted. So how does that translate into actual barriers for you to carry out your work? You, Gillian, you talked about the protection regime now being in jeopardy. So what are the actual consequences? Do people die because of this? And if so, how? Could you explain and give us a sense of what are the real world implications of these challenges to intergovernmental cooperation. And maybe we can do the same order as before. So starting out with you, Helen.
Well, thank you very much. And I think this is why it's so lovely to be able to have a conversation together rather than give a speech, because I think each of these issues really deserve a deep dive. So yes, I think in the last few years, we have seen a sense at times of perhaps less appetite to do a lot of normative changes and create new, say, for example, treaties. However, as Gillian mentioned, there are opportunities around the edges. And I think that's what we've got to hold on to. It's very easy to sit in the problem analysis today, but I think we also need to look at good practices and push them forward. Certainly, there's been some opportunities in our multilateral engagement more recently. We see, for example, the brand new treaty that will enter into force in January related to nuclear weapons, which not long ago, about a couple of weeks ago, the 50th state ratified that treaty banning the use of nuclear weapons. And I think we need to hold on to these elements where we see the multilateral system in action and working. At the same time, I do think that some of the experiences we've had in the last few years make it very difficult to find consensus. I think the idea of having global consensus today is quite challenging. However, we can still move ahead. But say if we, as you wanted to know, some practical examples, one of the things that's been quite interesting, I was speaking to the president of the ICRC, is that in this, I would say, virtual landscape, we've found a lot of opportunities to engage at high levels with government authorities, looking at things such as the requirement to do detention visits. As you could imagine, in times of COVID, those who are detained are very vulnerable. And we've found there's been opportunities as states clearly understand, as I mentioned before, the issues that face us today are not single sovereign state being able to be resolved. They are global, whether it be climate, whether it be protracted, whether it be a pandemic. I think the multilateral system is starting to hear and understand that one person and one state cannot resolve these issues. So I think we've found a number of instances where we have been able to have good multilateral engagements. And just a practical one, a couple of weeks ago, we were able to do a prisoner exchange in Yemen, which has, real challenges with existing destruction of the medical infrastructure, which I think, as the other two colleagues have spoken about, then is driven home and compounded with COVID, but able to do a prisoner exchange of 700 individuals, which involved a lot of negotiation, both with states but also with others. So I think we need to always step back and say there are things that, as Gillian said, we're moving forward on. There is also a sense when any state is under pressure to revert back to sovereign issues, and we need to constantly, as humanitarians, find ways to use our diplomacy and engagement to open up the space as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Helen, for those sort of messages of hope, in a sense. Gillian, you mentioned that states are actively closing borders, so it seems like the lack of international cooperation has a very direct impact on your work and on your ability to deliver on your mandate.
Well, thank you. Yes, and there are two examples that I'd like to give that again bring to life the sort of the concern that I've been expressing about the consequences of a decline in protection for refugees and asylum seekers. The first is search and rescue and disembarkation. I mean, that is the sort of visual picture that the world sees in the Mediterranean, now increasingly up the west coast towards Africa. And we've seen boats leaving from Bangladesh looking for protection in the Andaman Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And we've seen boats capsizing, deaths at sea in the Mediterranean. We're seeing them even in the English Channel. We've had an extraordinary case of a boat leaving Bangladesh with about 330 or 40 people on it, adrift for nearly 6 months, denied disembarkation in the region finally accepted by Aceh in Indonesia, but already 30 people had died. But we're seeing, I think, just in the last few days, 114 people have died in boats that have capsized in the Mediterranean, and another boat exploded off the west coast of Africa on the way up to the Canary Islands, and one could go on. But my point is that when states close their borders, and when states, as has happened in the Mediterranean, actually decline even search and rescue, which of course is it's hundreds of years old as a maritime tradition, is now being rejected. The idea of saving lives at sea is one of those fundamental principles developed across the international community from the 14th century onwards. And now we're finding that there's a rejection of those norms, and people are dying at sea in horrific circumstances. So I think that's a particular example, but another, and perhaps a more technical one, is the Security Council was unable to agree on keeping the cross lines across access from Turkey into or a number of countries into Syria. Now, this is shortly after the bombings and the missile attacks, which led to the displacement of nearly 1 million people into the north of the Idlib area. And UNHCR, with our wonderful partners, we're bringing temporary housing across those agreed Security Council supported lines of access. And the Security Council was not able to agree to extend those crossings, although one of them has been extended, I think, until the end of the year. But when you get that, they're very, very sort of physical manifestations of what happens when you have a decline from consensus and multilateral responses, and a retreat into unilateral national approaches. And I think one of the great lessons that we're learning from COVID is that we can no longer afford to act unilaterally. We must act together, and whether that's getting food through to people who need it and raising the funds to meet these almost incomprehensible numbers of people who do not have access to food. But we also have to look at this now as a very serious matter in the context of vaccines available across the world to all of those who need it. So one can cite good examples, and one can be aware of the poor ones. I'd like to finish, if I may, by just picking up the point that Valerie has made, and that is that although I've emphasised the right to claim asylum, non-refoulement, of course the longer term impact of COVID-19 on these displaced people and asylum seekers is in fact economic and social. And as Valerie has said, we're dealing with vulnerable people. Unfortunately, asylum seekers, people displaced in their own country, refugees, stateless people, tend to be at the bottom of that pyramid. They're not the only vulnerable, and Valerie's made that very clear, but they are highly vulnerable. They tend to be the ones that first lose their jobs in the informal economy. They're evicted. Their children are much more likely not to go back to school when schools resume. They're the ones least likely to get immunization. We are seeing, in the context of lockdowns and loss of jobs and economic decline, extraordinary, unprecedented rises in gender-based violence. And just to give you a concrete example, some of our call centres that we offer to assist people using remote technologies, a point that Helen has made, the importance of digital and more sophisticated technologies. We've stepped up our call centres to hear about concerns, and we've had 10 times the normal number of gender-based violence claims. And that really is the tip of the iceberg, of course. We're now seeing reports, for example, in Uganda, of teenage pregnancies spiking on and abuse of children and so on. So I'm sorry for the moment, I'll be a little more optimistic later on, hopefully in the conversation, but for the moment, I'm afraid the consequences of the sheer numbers of people on the move and the COVID on the economic and social lives of people, with rising mental illness as well, adding to these crises built upon crises, that we have never seen an environment in which we more clearly need to work across multilateral and multi-sectoral elements. And I know that the Secretary General is urging for this, a whole of organisation response, but working with states, with civil society, with financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. So those are the optimistic, or rather more positive ways forward. But we are at the moment in a deeply serious environment globally.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And it really strikes me that the use of digital technologies can also better help to assess the actual magnitude of the needs. As you suggest, it's also a way to collect more accurate and nuanced data on needs in ways that were not possible before. So Valerie, you mentioned the relevance of forming good partnerships with governments, but when that is not possible, what are the practical consequences for your work in addressing and reaching out to people in the most food insecure situations? Could you give us some illustrations?
Well, I mean, thank you. And like the others, I mean, multilateralism, there's no question, is more important than ever. And there have been a couple of bright spots that I wanted to highlight. You know, I think the coming together of the multilateral system around the debt deferrals has been absolutely key to provide that fiscal space for lower and middle income countries that is essential for them to be pumping that money into effective social protection systems that address the needs of the population. We've been advocating since over these past months for to avoid export bans and trade restrictions that hinder and obstruct supply chains. And I have to say, very few trade restrictions were put in place in the end, and that has been absolutely essential for the effectiveness of supply chains, both humanitarian as well as a commercial. And then, you know, the fact that the donor community has come together and continued to support urgent humanitarian action despite fiscal strains at home have been key. But it's not all bright spots, and I totally agree with Gillian on the absolute importance of on the protection side and on the inclusion side. I would add politicization. This isn't, you know, has come to the fore in a few contexts, and I think, you know, what we've seen at the geopolitical level with the inadequate funding and in some cases defunding of WHO has certainly had negative consequences for collaborative approaches on the ground in the midst of a health pandemic. So that is that has been very problematic. But then at the national and local levels, we've just seen that there have been differential responses. There have been sometimes, you know, blame gaming of rival groups that have prevented the necessary action to be taken, whether that's in Libya. We have the situation in South Sudan where rival groups were sort of pushing responsibility onto other parties, and that was just hindering the nation from moving forward. And more broadly, we have the history of countries that use food and food assistance as a means to shore up support, and that clearly is unacceptable. And then I also wanted to highlight the very practical and dangerous implication on some of the humanitarian access issues that remain hugely problematic. I mean, right now we are facing the very real prospect of famine in 4 nations: Yemen, South Sudan, Northern Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. In Burkina Faso already in the Sahel region in the north, we see at least 11,000 people who are just right at that tipping point into famine. And we know that there's a right of populations to be able to access the basic food, health, water that they need to survive. And there's an obligation of international actors to provide that support. And when access is blocked, whether it be by state actors or whether it is by non-state actors, then that's not just a violation, but it has, you know, real life and death consequences for tens of millions of people. And this is something that is a huge, huge challenge that prevents multilateral action from happening. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now that we have established different sorts of challenges and also offered some entry points for where we could go forward, it would be very interesting if you could share sort of how you approach these challenges, both in terms of tactical and operational considerations, but also perhaps in your sort of longer term planning and thinking. So basically issues that your organization or that you have control over and that you could do yourselves without forming coalitions or cooperating with others. So could I start with you, Gillian? I mean, you have really painted a sober picture of the challenges today, including these, the decline or the refusal of 100-year norms with regard to search and rescue, and governments closing their borders and violating principles of non-refoulement. But what are the measures that you can do in the sort of short term at the tactical and operational level to navigate this?
Well, thank you, and I'll take it in two parts. Firstly, what are we doing in the short term, and then what are we planning to do in the longer term, which perhaps comes to your point about adaptation. How are we adapting to this? Firstly, I think a point that I must say being relatively new to UNHCR, I might add, I'm very proud of, is that UNHCR is an emergency organization. In other words, we can go from 1 million bars of soap to Burkina Faso or Mali or Cameroon as an immediate health and hygiene response to the COVID crisis, to moving immediately into parts of Sudan to find a camp and land for a new camp for refugees in the Eritrean crisis, and the Ethiopian crisis, which is now, of course, expanding across boundaries. But so that we can produce emergency housing units, hygiene kits, water, and assistance, medical assistance, and so on. We can then send in our protection staff for protecting children. Usually something in the order of half of those displaced internally or externally are children, which is really quite shocking, but we have to have people specially trained for this. So part of the answer is that we can respond immediately. And that's what we do. I think the High Commissioner's used the term that we stay and deliver, and we have tried to stay and deliver, even at cost to the lives of our staff and families. But we also try to think longer term, and in a way that's what my part of the job is, and that's policies, prevention, working with other groups, building partnerships, and I think that what we're planning to do, and we are or starting to do, is to try to think beyond the emergency stage to the development stage, because we have to come back to the core root causes, the intersectionality. And I think Valerie's mentioned climate change, the impact of climate on desertification, destroying feeding grounds, destroying agriculture, forces displacement of people. It creates intercommunal conflict and growing poverty, and it also, of course, forces movements across into other parts of the world. So we need to look at poverty, climate change, inequality, racial and religious discrimination. I mean, you all know these root causes, and so I think we're trying to work at the multilateral level with states, but also with civil society, and most importantly with the business community that's really getting involved in these issues, and then finally, and perhaps even more importantly, with the international financial institutions. I think Valerie mentioned the importance of the debt forgiveness is crucial, and also perhaps not widely known, but the World Bank has given billions of dollars in the last few months to 14 or 15 countries it's identified as most at risk in grants, not loans. So I think that's a huge sort of shift in the interest of the banking community and international banking groups, where they're attempting to address poverty and facilitating the ability to feed people in the way that Valerie's described, but also to assist in the environments of conflict and the stress of people in those conflict situations. So I think one thing that we're learning, and I'll finish on this point, if I may, is we're really learning, I believe, to adapt to this new environment of disease, of a virus. But also the fact that it's a pandemic on top of other crises and interlinked crises. And one of those mechanisms of adaptation has been technology. And it's really been extraordinary how quickly, we've all found the mute button, or we're finding it, but more seriously, we are really stepping up our ability to use technology. And there are wonderful, wonderful positive stories of refugee journalists setting up a radio station in Mali to get education out to children, gathering up old-fashioned radios and putting batteries in them and getting them out to children so that when they're not at school, they've got some access to remote education. Establishing links with communities that we've really not been able to establish links with before. Importantly, many countries, and this is a very positive development, many countries have said, yes, we can protect our borders against COVID and other questions of national security, but we'll do it in a way which allows people to make asylum claims, and they can do it remotely. We can use quarantine. We can use all sorts of technologies to allow interviews to be conducted. If we can have this discussion now, you could equally have a discussion with an asylum seeker who's saying why they are fleeing criminal gangs in north of Central America, or why they had to leave the overcrowded camps in Bangladesh to find a way back to Myanmar. These are now technologies that are transforming what we're doing, and at UNHCR one of the things we're doing is stepping up that technology, improving access through call centres and providing linkages, for example, with the legal profession, who are providing pro bono legal advice across the world now to assist people who have been affected by COVID and affected by movements across countries. So I think we can be positive in saying that we've understood the need to act together across institutions, across governments, and civil society, and to use that remarkable technology to help each other in various ways.
Thank you so much. And it's remarkable indeed to learn about the ways that technologies are being used by main humanitarian organizations such as the UNHCR. Valerie, you represent the World Food Programme, and together with SIPRI, we have a common knowledge partnership. So we fully appreciate that you take an adaptation and learning approach to the work that you are doing, particularly in conflict-affected settings. Are you also using technologies in a similar fashion that the UNHCR is doing, or what are your operational measures in terms of adaptation and resilience, to put it in that context?
Well, thank you very much for that question. And I think I'll start from the end and then come back to the question on technology. We're best known as a emergency deliverer, operational organization, and we've built a lot of prowess and capabilities in order to reach people in the most remote areas with desperately needed assistance. What we've been doing is using that same capability to support a range of actors, and this is something that is increasingly essential in our interconnected world. Though we just had a high-level panel on Monday at our executive board. The Secretary General was there, and he was really calling for the UN to move beyond the siloed approach of the past, where each agency worked within its own mandate and its own rules, to a more inclusive multilateralism, I'm reading it, that includes multiple stakeholders from different parts of society, and which better captures the complex and interconnected nature of today's biggest challenges. So we see a responsibility there if we're reaching into these vulnerable communities to also help provide a platform for that reach to other partners. And so that's one of the ways in which we have been changing and adapting over time. We've also used digital technology to expand our reach. 10 years ago now, we determined as an organization that bringing food either from abroad or within countries to underserved communities was going to remain very important in some contexts, but in other contexts, food was available in the markets, and what people needed, what they lacked was access to that, and that fundamentally was an income issue, and that it could be cheaper and provide a broader range of choice, including enabling access to fresh produce, et cetera, if those same populations were supported with cash. So over that time, we went from being an organization that provided very small amounts of cash in particular circumstances to an organization that last year delivered $2.1 billion in cash to vulnerable, food insecure populations around the world. And we did that, and we were able to make that scale up completely on the back of digital technology and digital mechanisms. And that's one of the ways where we have been leveraging it. We've also been leveraging technology when it comes to information. Clearly, real-time information is always important when you're making decisions, but it's been even more important this year, where staff weren't always able to travel as much as they would to do those on the ground food security assessments, market assessments, et cetera. And so we have established and expanded a real-time monitoring system so that we can be tracking information in major markets where populations we serve shop and go to buy food and other basic goods, and using that to adjust and adapt our programs. And then, like all organizations, we're looking to use data much more concretely to build evidence and tell the story of our work, know what's working well and know what's not working so well. And that brings me, I do want to highlight the knowledge partnership that we have with SIPRI, because that's also been so important for how we've been evolving as an organization. I mean, we know that in conflict, food is an urgent basic need, and we have a reputation for being able to deliver it. But really understanding that impact on how food also and food assistance can contribute to peace is something that we really wanted to understand better. And we've been working with SIPRI over the past couple of years to conduct case studies and research, drawing on information we have and information SIPRI has, in order to really understand that link, look at ways in which our programs can be adjusted and adapted to have a greater impact on local peace and reconciliation processes, whether it's by bringing support to resource-constrained people and communities, and enabling them to access resources that are key for their resilience and their well-being, to working in a way that helps build that social cohesion, and even, where appropriate, to helping sort of nurture and build that social contract between a state and its people. And we've now got a body of evidence that demonstrates how we've been doing that and how we can do it further. And we're taking that partnership now further to look at how do we really measure that impact on peace. And that's going to be absolutely essential, not just for our work, but also for other partners. And then the last thing I would add is just that, we continue to keep that focus on the individual level, knowing, people in the areas where we work, what their needs are, the context, and tailoring assistance accordingly. But one of the experiences that we've had that's been amplified by COVID is about the need to marry that ground up approach with a systems approach that really helps understand what are the systems that touch or should be touching on populations, and how can we tweak, strengthen, adapt those systems in order to deliver more for those furthest behind. And in that way, by strengthening national systems, often it just takes technical engagement, knowledge transfer. We can, for a relatively low cost, impact tens of millions more people if they can be included in those systems, saving then that humanitarian assistance for filling those gaps on the ground.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie, and I very much agree that this knowledge partnership is really mutually beneficial. This is a nice example of synergies between sort of research and practice to disentangle complex situations and attribution factors and so forth. Let me now turn to you, Helen. Does sort of this type of modality adaptation strategies that Gillian and Valerie shared, do they resonate with the way that the ICRC tackles current challenges today? We talked about the role of technology, about supporting or strengthening national systems. Any additional observations from your perspective?
Yes, thank you. And very much has strong resonance with both Gillian and Valerie's take on these things. I wanted to stress and it goes back to my first point, that I think we cannot underestimate, despite my last intervention highlighting some of the bright spots, we cannot underestimate, as my two colleagues have raised, the challenges that we face today and the suffering that we face today. And I think as I said at the start, the exacerbation of pre-existing challenges that COVID has brought to bear, whether it be on individuals who are, in the particular case of the ICRC, already suffering under situations of armed conflict. And I mean, I think we have also seen some conflicts that have been exacerbated or gone further. We've got Burkina Faso, we've got Nagorno-Karabakh, and real concerns around heavy shelling of civilians, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. These are key issues that continue on as the world's attention is at issues like a pandemic. We've got some real challenges, and ICRCs really finding, for example, our own staff members, over 20,000 colleagues in war zones who themselves also get COVID because they have to be in bomb shelters. I think there's some really important and depth of practical ways we have to, as an international community, look at the situation before us today. But I did want to reflect both on the short term, as my two other panelists have done, and the long term. I think in the short term, much has been said. We need to look at multi-stakeholders. We need to, like UNHCR and other organisations, we are finding places such as discussions with the World Bank, their assistance with us in African states to set up medical facilities. I think the private sector, which traditionally was seen more as a place to get money from, perhaps now is more about getting ideas from. How do we find this intersectionality between the very innovative ideas that you see in the private sector that can be utilised by the humanitarian sector, and vice versa? I mean, I know, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of Gillian and Valerie, we all are incredibly proud of our colleagues in the field, the innovations they come up with. Water sanitation officers in places like Syria that are finding amazing ways to keep thousands of people in fresh water when they've got limited capacity. So I think this multi-stakeholder element, the intersectionality that I think we've all raised today, whether it be on intersectionality of tensions around climate, but I would say the intersectionality, and as I raised before, between the multilateral environment where we see the opportunities to create new ways and new policies and even new soft norms, but also how do we link across with those who have control, such as non-state armed groups, and then new technologies, I think, are critical. We've got a wonderful partnership too with SIPRI, and I think you might be aware we recently did some research together on autonomous weapons systems. And whilst technology has huge opportunities for us in the humanitarian sector, like the rest of the world, there are key challenges around the weaponization of technology that we have to be very careful about. So I think it's great to see when some of these reports, and as you said, the interface between academia and the practical world and real-time application is really critical. So that's where we look to great organizations like SIPRI to support us. But perhaps one of the long-term elements, apart from the practical things my colleagues are doing every day on the ground, is research around what is it that influences the behaviour of belligerents. And we've recently done a lot of studies on, thousands and thousands of military as well as non-state armed groups, those who are in control of the use of force. What is it that changes their behaviour? Is it just the law? Is it a sense of a culture? Is it a sense of unity? And how we can then more heavily and have a more sophisticated prevention discourse with those who are in positions of power to make decisions. And how can we go beyond just a normal understanding of power in states and look, for example, in certain countries, the use of religious leaders? How do we ensure that whilst the vast majority of those we serve are in the Islamic world, how do we link together Islamic texts with the traditional Geneva Conventions? How can we, for example, last year we dealt with over 20,000 senior military officers in training in the laws for, how can we use virtual reality better? And we're certainly doing a lot of work in that space. So to me, to answer to your question, I think we have to think long-term in new weapon systems and then deal with the reality of my colleagues in the day-to-day of the use of explosive weapons. So constantly work on those two planes, and certainly, as I said before, look to a more deeper relationships, which for those us in the humanitarian sector, we've often seen for one way, but a deeper thinking relationship together going forward.
Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing those views and insights. I would love for us to have an even more forward-looking focus now in the last part of this session, looking very much ahead and trying to think in concrete ways about what investments in prevention could look like for your organizations. You have mentioned the strategic use of partnerships and of finding complementarities, both with other multilateral actors, with civil society, with research organizations. But if you were to dream freely, what would the ideal sort of coalition of actors look like to be addressing the problems that we face today and the problems that we are likely to face tomorrow? And linked to that, I would be interested in hearing your views on where you think that your responsibility ends. You all mentioned that your mandates are as humanitarian organizations, but at the same time, there is this realization that the root causes are fundamentally about structural problems. So, where do you leave it to others to sort of address a particular issue? So that is a very broad set of a conglomerate of questions, but I would really love to hear your thoughts. So do we then start perhaps this time with you, Valerie?
Okay, well, I mean, it's tough because we dream and then we try to match that with some, things that have some grounding in reality. And certainly I very much subscribe to the Secretary General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire. I obviously would like to see wars end and conflicts end, but understand also that those occur often because of inequities and other issues that are underlying them, and that the status quo may not be the right option for many people. But I think having mechanisms where we are able to not just ensure the respect of international humanitarian law in conflict, though boy, it would be nice if we could ensure that, but also call on belligerents and enforce that call to ensure access, that very basic access to populations to services, and that obligation to support them. So it's, I think, mechanisms that really enable us to do that, taking some of the diplomacy beyond the conference rooms and the council chambers and into the streets, and having mechanisms that are functional in that regard. The second thing I would highlight is really just on the resourcing side. We can't have an international humanitarian system, the kind of last ditch effort to keep people alive, that's dependent on passing around a hat, trying to collect enough resources to get the job done. I mean, that is just, an expression in my country, no way to run a railroad. There's got to be a much more predictable way of financing urgent humanitarian work, and a solution for that, doesn't take world peace, but it does take political will, and I think it's absolutely key to enable us to kind of, focus on the job that needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Valerie. May I then pass over to you, Helen?
Thank you. It's like a lottery where you're going to call us up. Thank you. So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, what keeps me awake at night, or what I dream about, is actually, and I think it was beautifully said by Valerie, we're not going to revolutionize human behavior overnight, but if in fact states could live up to their existing obligations in my area under international humanitarian law, there would be a lot of issues that we would be able to move forward on. I mean, I think one of the things the pandemic has raised and made very clear, surfaced clearly, that violations of international humanitarian law, the destruction of a medical infrastructure, the sanitation, is basically the enemy of appropriate pandemic responses. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward, one of the things is to understand the importance of living up to these very, very well-established norms that, as Gillian said before, are under pressure now. They have been under pressure for some time, but they're under pressure. We see it every day, violated. At the same time, as I mentioned before, I think we have to learn when actually they are followed and understand best practices, as well as sitting in the problem analysis. I think that would be point one in relation to when you say what we dream about would be actually, it's quite a simple dream in one way, but very, very complicated in another. I think this issue that we've all raised at some point is the lack of politicization of aid or humanitarian assistance. And there is a big fear. I mean, we as an institution, ICRC, are concerned that there's going to be a protection rollback, as we all understand the pandemic is short-term, but also the long-term economic and social pressures that we see already arising. And I think tonight we've talked about them in different ways, but already arising with groups that were vulnerable in the first place. So I think there's something around, for example, and we've seen this with the same paradigm on counterterrorism, that it's important that we have to keep in coalitions, whether it be states, whether it be civil society, the private sector, keep reminding those in positions of authority that you cannot leave people behind. And we are only as, and it's an old saying, but we're only as strong as our weakest link. I think this idea that exceptional measures that have been in place due to the pandemic, challenges with access. We've had incredible negotiations to be able to make sure that our planes, and I'm sure Valerie and Gillian have had the same, to make sure that our humanitarian assistance can get through, as Gillian mentioned, the border closures, to make sure that our humanitarian colleagues are able to access places. So I think there's something in that space. We have to make sure that these exceptional measures, as in counterterrorism, similar paradigm, exceptional measures with legitimate rights of states to protect their own personnel, whether it be from terrorist acts of terrorism or be pandemics, are not used to actually further make life difficult for those who are in vulnerable situations, in our instance, those who were victims of armed conflict. So I think there's something in that space around being careful, being intelligent, finding the right balance of making sure that we don't roll back well and hard fought for protection measures as we move forward. And then the third issue I think that we need to have much bigger coalitions on is around intersectionality, as I mentioned before, particularly I think as it pertains to climate. I think there's no doubt every single of us tonight have mentioned that intersectionality between the vulnerability of the world, the environment, and whether it be conflict, hunger, or those who are fleeing to safety. So I think these are the key things. Certainly, a basic wish that one follows the existing, that those are in positions of authority follow existing norms that are clearly set out. I think in prevention, we really need to make sure that there's an understanding in both intellectual, humanitarian, and almost economic sense of the value that is got from prevention activities, to make sure that if you don't, for example, bomb a hospital, the prevention impact of having correct targeting measures during the conduct of hostilities prevents terrible, terrible suffering that has a flow-on effect that involves then people being displaced. So I think it's having a better understanding of the interconnected nature of many of the problems we're trying to solve. I wanted to finish actually on the statement that I think it was a former UNHCR High Commissioner stated, which was there's no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems. Mrs. Ogata, who was a wonderful lady, Gillian would know well, we as the humanitarian sector, of course, can partner up together. We can engage with states, we can partner with the private sector. But at the end of the day, the money, the resources, and the genuine depth of problem solving sits squarely and legally obligations with states. So I think we can continue to engage, find creative new ways to do so, but I think we have to come back to where the problems come from.
Thank you so much, Helen. So your message is essentially, if you go back to basics, that's the ultimate form of prevention. If you just stick to your existing legal obligations, we won't have to deal with all the follow-on consequences.
One element, sorry, just to jump in. I mean, I think even if everyone followed the laws of war, unfortunately, armed conflict is a horrific experience. But as a basic, if we could follow what we agreed upon to date, that would make the world a better place, and we could build from there.
Thank you so much, Helen. Over to you, Gillian. Do you agree?
Well, thank you very much for the questions, and it's been terrific listening to my fellow panelists, and I agree with, of course, everything they're saying. There are two approaches that I would like to take, and one is based on our experience recently, and that is improving the level of community engagement and localization. We've found in COVID, or in the context of COVID, that we've really come more deeply to understand how important it is to work with the people who are actually in those communities. They don't go away. They're not dependent on an NGO contract. They're not, they're utterly committed to their environment. They know what's needed, and we are trying at UNHCR as part of our initiative to decentralize our work, to get out into the field more than we've done perhaps a little in the past. And we're now working with religious groups much more than we are with Religions for Peace. We are also working with the voices of refugees. I think an important future initiative has got to be to ensure that refugees are heard more. In other words, no discussions about us without us. It's imperative that we include. There's some wonderful, for example, refugee-led organizations led by women who particularly talk about the role of women in peace, the need for women to be at the table in peace discussions. And Helen will know this all too well. So I think I'd like to see in my perfect world a much greater respect for local communities, drawing in local communities, and then drawing in the wider community, in particular the business community, which I think is becoming more and more, the corporate community is actually becoming more engaged. But at another level, I should warn you that I was born at the end of the war. I grew up at University Law School with the Charter of the United Nations. I would, in my best world, I would like us to rebuild the consensus around those fundamental principles of the Charter. I think that would be a great way to start again 75 years later as we come to the 75th anniversary. I deeply believe, and thank you for quoting Madame Ogata, by the way, Helen, she's quite right that you need political will. And I am constantly amazed by the reality that with political will, we can solve these problems. They're very doable. They're not so difficult to achieve. But we need to rebuild that consensus that was possible at the end of the Second World War. I would like to see a system within the UN that's working better, so that system can support that local community effort that I've been talking about. So, but perhaps I could finish by saying, you were asking, how I would hate to be accused of expanding our mandate, but when does the work of UNHCR end? And we have to be careful. You have to be careful of your mandate. But I think our mandate increasingly is to work with development partners on investment. And I say that because I deeply believe that the root causes of conflict and the utter despair of people displaced lie in inequality of one form or another. And I think it's inequality that we can solve. We can respond to it in ways that how shocking for Valerie to be telling us 600 and something million people without access to food is a shocking reality when you know the inequality across the globe. And I think if we could go back to the spirit of the Charter itself, then I think we can work a little more effectively towards dealing with inequality, building political will. I think that's what we need to do. And can I perhaps finish, as I should do, as an official of UNHCR, to say I really do believe that the Global Compact, which is not a legal document, it's written for the general audience, but it talks about shared responsibilities for those in distress and those in need of protection. So I think we have the tools, we have the law, we have the principles, but we have to build back the trust and the political will to solve these problems. So that's my view of the future. Thank you very much.
That is indeed a very inspiring view of the future, Gillian. And may I then present you with a final challenge. If you were to capture your main takeaway from this session with one word, what would that word be, and why? Can I start with you again, Valerie?
No, don't start with me first this time. I need a little more time to think. Start with the others, please.
I will take a volunteer then. Gillian.
Well, I'll volunteer. I'll volunteer. I was given two words in my briefing, I have to say, and I've pondered which I would give you now. But I think the one I have to go for, and the word that I think is the word of the year, and that is inclusion. If we include people, and Helen said it, we cannot leave people behind, and the Secretary General has said it. Leave no one behind. It's the willingness to leave people behind, to exclude them, that I believe has led to so many of our global problems. We can manage COVID, but we have to include everyone. We can manage food insecurity if we include. So I'll leave it with that one. Thank you.
Many thanks, Gillian. Yes,
May
Helen.
I jump in and say, yes, I was, Gillian, I didn't get any of my words, but I was going to say either inclusion or diversity, this need to widen our minds and widen not just the voices we hear, but the way we solve problems. But I won't repeat yours. What I will perhaps then come up with is a word. There's something about adaptability. I think everything that we've touched on is the fact that we currently, whether it be technology, whether it be thinking, whether it be widening up the way we think about multilateralism and partnerships. So I'll go for, we'll build from inclusion, play that word game, and then I'll add in adaptability.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen. And now over to you, Valerie.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad because then I get to build on theirs. And I would say, in addition to inclusion and adaptability, I add investment. And I think we need to be investing in people in order to lift them out of these circumstances that they find themselves in cyclically. We need to be investing in systems to ensure those systems work for those furthest behind. And we need to invest in solutions that work. So I add investment to the other two.
Wonderful. And on that note, I would like to direct my sincere thanks to all of you. You have been an amazing panel and have certainly really inspired all of us and provided very insightful views and perspectives and ideas for the future. I also want to thank our online audience for staying engaged. Stockholm Security Conference will continue for 2 more days, and it's good to secure your spot at our upcoming webinars. Tomorrow, we will continue our discussions about the challenges for the OSCE and nuclear arms control in times of COVID-19. Thank you.